Hey guys, it's Rob, Rare Candy Tattoo. We're at Golden Dragon Tattoo Studio, and today I'm going to teach you how to tattoo a horror portrait. Let's go! Okay, so we're just getting into the stencil, and I'm just placing it on the skin to find where I want it to go, and then I'm just going to make some little marks with my Sharpie, just so I can easily find that position again. And then we're going to prep the skin ready for this. We're just going to use my green soap for this. Get it nice and wet. And then shave all the hair off, which helps you apply your stencil better, helps you clean the skin better, and your hair is quite strong, so it can actually resist the tattooing process as well, so get it all gone. And once you've shaved the area, I like to use Prep Stuff by Stencil Stuff to clean that skin properly. Helps get all the oils out of the skin, and it helps your stencil stick on better. And then now for Stencil Stuff, which I've used lots of different brands of these, and I just keep coming back to this one. This is just the one that I like. It's quite easy to spread across the skin. Some of them are quite jelly, but I like to put one layer on and kind of let that soak in a little bit, and then just top it up a little bit more before I put the stencil on. I find that if you do that, you just make sure that you have actually got it into all the pores of the skin, and it helps you not have little missing spots on your stencil when you peel it. I kind of just use the back of my hand now to take any of that excess off, and then I'll put a little bit more on. But not as much as the first time, you don't need to go crazy. And you kind of want that to have like a tacky feel to it rather than a wet feel. So sometimes I will just give it like a little pat with a tissue just to take off some of that excess, and that feels about right for the stencil now. So now we're just going to line this back up with those marks that I made earlier. Keep it as flat as possible. And I made some little snips in my stencil earlier around the neck. Is good for portraits, just to help you wrap that around the curvature of the part of the body that you're placing it on. And pretty much just going to give this a good press. You don't need to leave it on the skin for ages, but you just want to make sure that your stencil is applying properly. Give it a good press all over. There aren't really any wrinkles in this stencil, so that's a good sign that it fits this part of the body really well. And then I'm just going to slowly peel it off, rather than just ripping it off, because if any of the stencil hasn't transferred, you can just go back and just press it back and make sure that everything you want is on there. But you have to be careful when you peel them off when you've cut little snips into them, because it will just rip if you don't take it carefully. But so far, so good. Perfect. So now we're just going to let this stencil dry. I do keep my stencil on my station just in case I need to reapply at any point. But yeah, we're just going to leave this to properly dry now. I always give it a little pat with a tissue just to get any of that excess stencil stuff that's still on the skin and on the areas where the stencil isn't. Just helps it dry a little faster. But we need to let the stencil set, especially for colour work because the inks are quite sort of sticky, so they can just take your stencil clean off if you're too quick going into it, and they're not very watery. So the products that I'm using to do this tattoo today, I've got an Inkjector Flight X1. I've used a lot of tattoo machines and I always go back to this one because it hits hard, keeps up with my hand speed, and it allows me to just do things how I want to do them. I'm using a mix of Fusion, World Famous and a bit of Eternal inks, Stella V2 cartridges from Killer Ink, and all of my disposables are Killer Ink products. And my process butter is Hustle Butter. That is just the best stuff. I've been using it for a long time. If you want to get a full list of everything that I'm using, you can skip to the end of the video. There'll be a list of everything there and you can go and buy some for yourself. Right, so we're about to get into the tattoo now. After leaving the stencil to dry. And I'm pretty much going to start generally from the bottom and work up. Mainly to protect my stencil, so I'm going to be wiping down rather than wiping over the stencil. I'm going to start with my black ink or the darkest area of the portrait, which is underneath his collar. Basically at the beginning, it's almost like a little experiment with the skin to find out how it's going to behave. And that's where I'll kind of choose the voltage of my machine if I need to reduce it for any reason. And just figure out all those important details before I start getting up into the serious parts of the portrait, which is obviously the face. And we're pretty much just going to ease in at first and just figure out what's going on and how everything's behaving. I always find as well, it's good to start with your black where possible because it's the most common colour that any tattoo artist is using. So it's the colour that you're going to be the best at applying to the skin. So you can quickly find out what you need to know and then proceed from there. But generally with colour work, you will want to start with your darker tones because they can mucky up your lighter tones as you're wiping, and just makes it easier for you to continue and not have to worry about something else on top of everything else that's on your mind during this. But generally with a portrait anyway, the sort of shirt area to the bottom of the chin is where you'll get a chance to figure out quite a lot of the colours that you're going to be using and how they look together, and gives you a chance to change your mind if you don't want to use what you thought you might be using today. And when I'm packing this black, I'll kind of do little circles and follow my shapes that I've made with my stencil. I think that a lot of people's initial questions about stencils when they see them is like, how the hell do you know what you're doing? And it's basically like a little mini map, which this one you can tell who it's of, but sometimes they're such a minefield, especially if you put in lots of blood splatters and things like that on the piece. So what I like to do is, because I work off my iPad, I do my stencil on my iPad and I lay my stencil over my picture and I reduce the opacity on it so it's very, very light, but I can still see where the lines were on my picture. So if I ever get confused during the tattoo, because it does happen, I can just refer to my guide basically and say to myself, you know, what's this funny line that I've done here? And get myself back on track. And I think doing that also helps with just eliminating some of the time that the tattoo can take, because you're just saving time struggling about things that don't need to be maybe as hard as they could be without doing that. I'm basically going to keep putting this black in until I've got a good section done. And although I'm going to work from bottom to top, I kind of take the piece in chunks, so I'll do all the black in a certain area, and then I'll maybe do my darker colours in that area as well. And then I won't put the light ones in either just yet, or maybe even more towards the end of the whole piece. So what I'll do is I'll do the black and the darker colours, and then I'll pick my next section that I'm going to move to, and I will put my black and the dark colours in again, and then I might come back and do the lighter tones, so that I know that my next section dark colours are already done, so I don't have to worry about them getting brushed down onto what I've just done, because sometimes they do stick and they don't wipe off, and although they don't heal dirty, you want your piece to look great today and get that big smile off your client when they go to the mirror. So as I mentioned, I'm using the Injector Flight X1, and I'm running this right now at about 14.5 volts, which sounds ridiculously high, but I think the difference in voltage machine to machine makes a big difference. So a big number for this machine would probably act and behave the same as a smaller number on a different machine. And I will always start on that voltage, and I will generally not have to turn it up, but I may have to turn it down if the client's got sensitive skin or older skin. The older that you get, the sort of more tendy skin can become, which is all a part of that initial stage of just figuring out things with this black ink now. I like this machine because it just hits really, really hard, and it will generally put whatever I'm doing in first go, so I don't have to keep going back over things. And the way that I tattoo myself is I kind of adjust my hand to do the things that I want to do, so there'll be different techniques like my tight circles for packing, or soft brushing for just laying a softer shade, or I'll reduce the sort of pressure from my hand to make sure that it doesn't saturate completely straight away if I want to lay some colours on top of each other. The batteries last basically all day on it, and I'm running it on a high voltage on this machine, so I imagine anyone that's using a lower voltage on it could just go for hours and hours. It's easy to wrap, which is always helpful. And I've just never had any problems with it. I've never had any reason to doubt it. And I've basically tattooed with every big brand available, and this is just the one for me. Yeah, I use Panthera Black because it tends to heal really, really black. And I think when you're doing, well, just in general anyway, you want your black to be as dark as possible, because that's where you're going to get your contrast and your depth from. It goes in the skin really easy, and I mean, I know people that use it for fine line tattooing all the way to straight up blackout. It just does everything. Again, it's not something that I can see myself changing products on. It just does everything. But yeah, it's just ease of use, I think, apart from the final product. And as I was saying earlier, your black is your most used colour, so you definitely don't need to be making things difficult by using a black that you're not sort of comfortable with using. Some of them can be quite thick, or some of them aren't really like a multi-tool, kind of ink where you can use it for everything. And I like to, where I can, make things easy for myself and just have that one thing that I know I always use and can do everything with it. Because I do tattoo other things other than these types of things, so I know that I'm safe and I've got what I need all the time. I think definitely taking your time with it is important. If you're really trying to get through it as quickly as possible, it's going to be quite difficult to saturate the skin. Finding the voltage of your machine that works for you, I think, is key. I noticed that on a lot of questions on sort of tutorial videos and similar things, a lot of people are very, very concerned with what is your machine, what is your voltage, and when you start getting into things like voltage, the voltage that I'm using this machine on right now may be completely wrong for you. You know, the way I hold it and the way that I move is why this voltage works for me. So a little bit of experimenting and finding what's right for you is going to help you saturate the skin the best. You can saturate the skin just as well on a really low voltage, but this is just through general experience and sticking to it and finding what works for me that I've sort of come to these settings. But you also want to make sure that you do have enough ink in the well of your cartridge, because you can't saturate if you've not got the ink there to do it with. Also, the stretch that you get on the skin is really important. So I'm not massively stretching this skin because it's quite naturally tight skin there. But if I need to, rather than just pulling down on the skin, I'll kind of maybe stretch this way, and this way with my fingers. And I've also got this hand as well, so I'm stretching from like 4 points, so that skin in the middle is like really tight. So especially on softer parts of the body, that is necessary, because again, I just don't think you can achieve a solid saturation without doing that. So there are quite a lot of factors, and again, that's part of that experimenting that we're doing now with this black and just figuring out what I need to be doing. But that won't stop as I get up here and the skin changes its elasticity. I'll need to figure that out again as I go, and something that I struggled with when I was learning was that very thing. I sort of sorted my machine out, got going, and then I sort of hadn't learned my sort of medium properly yet and understood that the skin isn't the same at the bottom of this portrait as it's going to be at the top. So you have got to stay it sharp and concentrate on what you're doing. But I do find the circular motion is good in general for solid colour tattooing. You will find that I'll be brushing back and forth with different techniques, but I feel like you get your best saturation from circular motion. And again, I'm constantly checking my stencil and what my lines are, because even though it's fairly obvious, especially when you're using black, you do not want to put that black in that section where it's not meant to be black, because you cannot do anything about it once it's in there and you are saturating properly, because we are only human. So having that next to me to just glance at and make sure I am doing what I think I'm doing is just really helpful. Really, you want to be in and out in one pass when you're sort of packing solid colour, which can sometimes be challenging depending on the ink or the part of the body that you're on. But basically, when I just do that little bit now, it's done. I'm going to leave it alone now, and I'll moisturise that as I'm going to Just make sure that I'm not wiping at it and mithering it any more than I have to. But there is a limit to the skin, and there is only so much you can do. You do have to be careful of these things, and if you're ever unsure that you're overworking, or we may even see today what I'm about to talk about, but some of the lighter colours can be quite insipid, I think is the word, and the blood will come through and it'll show a lot, and sometimes it can really put you off and make you feel like you haven't saturated the skin when really you have. So just moving onto a different area for a little bit can be really helpful, because a lot of the time you'll find that you have actually saturated that skin properly, rather than going over and over and over it, trying to get it to do something that has already been done. It's just going to start bleeding more and confusing you more, making you think that you haven't done it. But these are just kind of things that I've been through myself when I've been learning, and tattooing's quite a hard thing to explain. So it's good to hear things like that, I think, and I feel like if you know what the problems can be, you can stop them from happening. But definitely a big factor, apart from your own hand and speed, is making sure that your machine's in sync with you. And even the needles that you're using can make a difference as well. I like to use this 15 mag. I do a lot with this. I know that there's artists out there that will swear that you need a specific needle for every single little thing, which you can say is true. But I will do a lot of my stuff just with this 15 mag. I like to use the corners of the mag and the edges. I mean, I can even line with this if I want to, and sometimes I will. But I like the amount of coverage that I get with this needle. It's small enough to saturate properly. It's not too big that I can't do things like that if I want to with it. But if you're ever using a needle that you're struggling to get into a particular space, just swap it for a smaller one. Use what you need to do what you're trying to do. And I'm still just going along and putting loads of this black section in. And I'm pretty much gonna kind of go around until I'm underneath that mask, and then I'll start putting the darker tones in and just maybe even completely box off this bottom section before we go further up. I feel like when I'm doing anything like this, I've got like a battle plan, but it's not something that I'll necessarily stick to. But working bottom to top is something that's generally every time that is what I'll do. But when it comes to using the colours shortly, the ones that I've got out might not be what I want, or I might not like what they look like when I start doing it, and I'll change my mind and get some other ones out. But again, if you just take your time, take a small section and make sure that you're happy with that bit, that's how you'll then proceed forwards. So that's a good tip for saturating, to be honest, because if you do like a little corner and it is definitely saturated, that's what you need to do going forwards. Keep that same smooth hand speed and those same, size of circular motions that you're using, and give it a good clean and make sure that it is fully saturated as you're going, because you're taking your time and you're cleaning it and checking it. If you wipe it clean and it's not saturated, then you can go, oh, okay, and you can adjust and again figure out what you need to do to saturate, and then keep moving forwards, so you're not tattooing anything unnecessarily and doing sort of damage to the skin to then go, crap, that's not saturated, I have to go back. slow and steady wins the race. If you just take that little extra time, you'll saturate so well first time that you don't have to go back and sort of mess about correcting things. Rather than if you're going so fast that you're getting so much work done that it comes down to you having to sort of go back and correct things. So that pit, I just feathered that black out a little bit with a bit of brush shading, because that's where I'm going to pull some dark brown into that soon. So this is a little bit of a tighter section, which I'm starting to have to use the corner of my mag there, which, if that's not something that you're comfortable with doing, don't do it. Like, just because I do it doesn't mean that someone else should. It's just that that's how I do it. But that is where you would get a smaller mag generally and continue as you have been. So this little bit here is really, really dark on the stencil, but it does have a bit of what I'm probably going to use grey in it. So I'm going to kind of just gently brush over this with the black, so it's got a little bit of an undercoat on it. And that'll just help me make sure that it is as dark as I want it to be when we get to it. So I'm almost not saturating now. I'm doing a bad job of tattooing, if you want to put it that way, to just lay a bit of an undercoat on it. We don't always have to have things super solid, but I feel like when you're explaining things like this, maybe to people that are just learning and don't understand everything, putting it into words like that helps it make sense a little bit more. So if we're saying that really saturated, solid tattooing is good tattooing, and I'm trying to just put a little coating of ink on it, I'm going to almost not do what I've just been telling you to do and kind of tattoo it badly on purpose. What that'll do by just brushing these sections rather than packing them so solid is it will stop the skin from, you know, being too damaged, and also stop it from being too packed with colour that you can't fit anymore in it, is the way I like to think of it. Once you've really, really packed something solid, it's like there's just no more room to take any more ink in there. But throughout the tattooing process, if you just imagine that you've got almost like a little meter of how much this skin's going to let you do to it today, and try and focus on staying within that amount, 100% being fully saturated, and then those little areas that I'm just laying some colours in or getting ready for other colours will be maybe 30 or 50% saturated. So this is another section it's really dark, but it's not quite black. So I'll just brush that in, and I'm really hardly doing anything to the skin here in terms of trauma, so I'm going to be able to just tattoo back over that when it comes to making that solid and choosing the right colour to go there. But I know that it's marked out now and I don't have to worry about my stencil coming off in that area, because I'm quite a messy tattooer in terms of like my ink getting everywhere while I'm tattooing. I watch some artists and they're so insanely clean start to finish, and I just don't get it, because I can't do that. and I know that not everyone else can either, so I feel like it's nice to know that we're not all perfect and we make a mess while we're working, which again does come back to the working bottom to top in general anyway. That's going to help that a lot. Again, I'm just laying this in, I'm not really saturating here, I'm just darkening that up so that when I put dark grey again it's just going to fade in a bit smoother and not look as heavy, because this is a shadow, so it should be kind of hard to make out what it is to a degree. But this portrait that we're doing, this photo is coming up to being 50 years old now, so to some extent you can make up what you're doing a little bit. A general rule with portraits and realism is to not tattoo, to only tattoo what you see, which I do think is true. But I also think with a lot of these kind of rules that you hear about like that, they're not quite, I don't think you should take it seriously. Like another one, that you don't or shouldn't use line work in realism. You can definitely use lines. I think when you say it, people expect you to know what that means. But what it means to me is, don't circle round the eyes with a liner, because it'll make the eyes look like cartoon eyes. But what I think it sounds like to beginners is, do not use a liner in realism at all. Which you need to use them. There's lots of things that I'll use one for today, which might be strands of hair, which again, I can do that with this mag, and sometimes I will if it's flowing in the shape that works for me. Otherwise I will use a really, really thin little liner to do those things with. And a lot of highlights and little speckles and things like that are really good for liners. And I think as well, sometimes you should choose yourself whether something will look better or hold better in terms of like the aging of the tattoo if it had a line. So this portrait's got quite dark edges here, so it will hold without being lined. But sometimes you might want to put an edge on the side of a portrait, or if it's got a coloured background, you might want to maybe ever so slightly use a darker colour just on the edge of the face, just to really lock it in there. Which again, things like that come with experience, but it's nice to, where possible, know about them before they happen, so you don't have to watch a tattoo that you really, really loved age badly and have to do it again. It's always nice to get it right first time if you can. I learn the best from my mistakes. When I make a mistake, I never forget about it. Whereas if you just Mr. Perfect start to finish, I don't think you learn things like that. Which I'm sure is very nice, but that's not me. So I'm just gonna feather out some of this solid black that I did, where it meets a darker colour afterwards. I feel like something that helps with tattooing things that are realistic is just remembering what it actually looks like. So like I was saying about, obviously you should try and stick to your picture. Sometimes your picture just isn't super HD or the best possible quality, depending what it is, whether that's a really old movie like this, or whether it's a photo of a family member and, you know, that's the best that they have. available. If you can spend time learning how shadows work and the general form of a face, it can help you correct those things while you're tattooing or essentially make what you're tattooing look more like what it is, because the picture might not quite be doing enough for you, which a lot of that does come from drawing. I learned to draw basically just copying what was on the front of my VHS boxes when I was a kid and just drawing them straight onto paper, which I think is why I've kind of slipped into enjoying this style of work, because I get to just look at the picture and it's of something that I really like, and I get to make it go from there to there, which is one of my strengths. But drawing will help you understand what you're doing. So if you are a black and grey artist, you're probably going to want to colour in black and white pencils or charcoals and things so although the medium isn't the same, the outcome it's going to help you a lot. So I draw lots of sort of my favourite movie characters and icons just in a pad with Prismacolor pencils, and it helps me learn a bit of colour theory and how undercoating your picture can change the end result, and certain things like that can be transferred into tattooing. I don't think that anyone has to be able to draw to tattoo. I know that's a massive subject, but I don't think that's true. I think you need to be able to understand things about art, like shadow, shape and form, and colour theory. If you're doing colour tattooing, you can teach people to draw as well. I think some people think that you're just born with it, but you can learn. Like, I'm not the most creative person in terms of drawing things completely out of my mind. It would just take me so long compared to other people that I know that can just zip it straight on a piece of paper. It absolutely amazes me. But we've all got our own individual strengths and talents, and I think when you find what yours are, and they're usually what you enjoy, probably because you're good at it, and then you can stick to it and get better at it and hopefully be doing what makes you happy, which all of these kind of things are movies and cartoons and games that I grew up playing, and I still play and watch them. So it's like getting to give someone a tattoo that you might not have room on your body to have, because I'd have this. I think that makes it awesome. It's one of my favourite things about the job. I've nearly done all of this black in this bottom section now. So I'm changing colours now, so I'm going to clean my cartridge and get all that black off it. And when you start dipping into your other colours, you need to make sure that your needle is clean, because you'll deposit a bit of the ink that's on your needle into your new colour. Which I will do when I start mixing colours together later, but just initially you want to see your colour for what it is and not have it tainted in any way. And again, I'm just going to do a little section that's in the shadow and it's dark, which will give me a chance to look at my colour and see that I like it, and if that's what I want to keep using as I go forwards. Because I am not an expert of every single ink that's in my drawer, and they've all been, you know, created with a different colour base, so the way they mix with other colours might always be the result that you want it to be. So again, I think working dark to light helps in that sense, because your light colours are the ones that tend to stand out the most, and I think that your dark, shadowy areas are essentially just what help those colours hold up. So I think it's the best place to figure out what's going on. When I pour my inks out for any piece like this, I'll get generally what I think is right out, or in that, you know, that ballpark of what I'm doing. But I think something nice to hear about work like this, because it can really stress you out doing this type of work because you want it to look so good. You can drive yourself mad worrying about your palette, and ultimately, unless you're, you know, a genius, you're probably not going to get the exact colours that are on any photo. It can be done, but I think what's important to focus on is keeping your colours in sync with each other. So this particular brown that I'm using right now may not be a 1-for-1 match to the photo, but as long as my next colour that I place next to it matches in the same way that it does on that photo, so the way I'm tattooing, the end result will look right. And I think that's kind of a part of the fun side of tattooing as well. It does feel awesome when you like straight up nail a realism portrait and just the colours, everything are exactly like the photo. But it also feels awesome when you're cleaning it off at the end and, you know, your colours are kind of your own on it, and you've made your own unique version of this tattoo. Because especially with things like movie tattoos or musicians and famous people, there can be a pretty limited supply of good references. So there may well be, you know, hundreds of other people out there that have the same portrait of Ghostface as you, or the same portrait of Joker from Batman. He's a popular one. But if you've used, you know, your own sort of palette and not got that exact 1-to-1 version, that's essentially a unique portrait at the end, which no one else has got. Sometimes I'll almost do it on purpose as well, where I tend to use like a really dark purple at the moment, and I'll kind of give the edge of my black a little purple tinge as it then pushes into the colours on the face or the clothing. And I like that effect, just to make the piece a little bit unique. But a lot of the earlier tattooing that I did was, I wouldn't necessarily say it was new school, but it was very cartoony and superhero type stuff, and a lot of things in that style tend to have like a really bright blue or bright pink highlight on the edge of them, and I think that's just something that I occasionally try to put into my more realistic tattooing, just to add a little touch. I generally find people that are into colour tattooing in general, and especially these kind of movies and stuff, are quite open to letting you have some freedom with their piece and having a bit of fun with it. So when you can, it's nice to. But I think little things that when I started doing this work that helped me a lot, behind the scenes kind of stuff, you can use your iPad to colour pick. So if you hold your finger on a particular part of the picture, it'll pick that colour so you could continue drawing with that colour. So if you do that, and then you get a really large size brush and just colour your page in that colour, you can have your whole iPad screen coated in this brown, for example, and then you can dig into your ink drawer or cabinet and hold them next to your screen and actually just be like, yeah, that is pretty damn close to that colour. I think that's helpful, and I still do that now. I'll never stop doing that. Like when I'm getting into this face later, I'm gonna colour pick some bits and see what the iPad says that the colour is, because sometimes it's quite hard to read them. Like you can press on something that you think looks pretty brown. I mean, I can tell on this picture it's quite pinky red in some of those shadowed areas, so I might make those sections a little bit more obvious and maybe make them a little bit more red, just so that we've got a little bit of our own touch on this piece. So I'm just laying in some little details here, which I haven't even put them on my stencil. So there you can see that things like that happen, but thankfully we're on quite a simplistic part of the design where I can sort of do my own thing here. It's just some shadows on the collar. I'm just gonna mark some of them in. Nothing crazy, but just so it's there and I can kind of get one of these sections almost done. So there's like an edge on this collar that I'll decide later whether to do a little shadow coming across it as if it's part of his shirt, or if I might use a background colour and kind of just cut the tattoo off there. Things like that I'll kind of decide as I go, see how the piece is going and make a decision along the way. I know that some people like to be really, really prepared from start to finish and know exactly what they're going to do, and I am one of those people, but what I find is when you get stuck into it, it always ends up going its own way anyway. So I try not to stress myself out too much beforehand, which is really easy to do when you're taking things seriously and you want to do your best. But I think some little things to help take that pressure off yourself if you are one of those kind of people is to, the night before, you know, at the latest I'd say make sure that you've got your stencil done. I know people do them in the mornings before they tattoo, which again is fine, but some people will benefit from having their stencil done already and one thing ticked off that list of things to stress about. And also, you know, the day before that you're due to tattoo a piece, just figure out your colours. You know, just get the ones that you think you're going to need out, just so that you can go to sleep with less stress. When I started doing this kind of work, I literally couldn't sleep. Worrying about tomorrow. And as annoying as it is, worrying is good, because I think you end up just doing the best piece because you're so locked in and you've thought of everything at that point. But I do think just preparing a little bit and getting your stencil, your general colours, and just have a good study of the piece and just say to yourself, like I have, I'm going to do this bottom section and then I'm going to move forwards from there and I'm going to do this bit next, and just get a general idea. Like I said, I always end up going off my plan anyway. I'm not quite regimented like that. It's like I'm winging it, but that's all a part of the fun, I think. So I'm just moving on to a section that's got a bit of a brighter colour in it, and I have dipped two together to make this one because none of them came out of the pot matching it very closely. And I'm just going to do a little bit and then I will decide whether they're right or not. Don't need to do loads, but just enough to see. And I'm like pretty happy with that colour, so I'm going to do a little bit more. But I'll generally, when I'm figuring out colours and stuff, I'll choose a part that's maybe not too in your face. So if for some reason you do just completely end up changing the colours that you're using, if it's off to the side of the piece, it can kind of just look like a little different shade where like some lights hit the collar or the jacket differently. Which again, these are just things that I think are nice to know when you're just starting out in work like this and you're absolutely stressing yourself out, because that's what I do. I'm the stressed guy. And I wish I wasn't, but I do feel like it's part of the reason why I, you know, got good at what I do. You're your own worst critic. And I think just some things to consider, not on the technical side of tattooing, but you really shouldn't be shy to send a little message to an artist that you look up to. Because what I have found is that they seem like really, really scary people, and actually they're just people doing the same job as you, and most of them are lovely anyway, and they also will remember when they were in your shoes, and it's quite nice to help people. I love helping people. I think people are under the impression that a lot of tattoo artists are quite gatekeepy and they don't want you to know their stuff, and some of them may well be, but helping someone out isn't going to stop you getting your work. I always feel very, very happy after getting a little message asking for advice, and just knowing that there's people out there that particularly really like your tattoos. And so message the artist that you look up to, and hopefully they'll message you back and tell you all their secrets, and then you can steal it all, take all their work off them, and now you'll be famous. I'm just kind of having a little go with this colour. I think I'd like to get a little bit more of a red tinge in it. So I'm essentially just dipping into a little bit of a red colour and just altering it a little bit. And then once I've sort of figured that out, with any luck, it'll stick in my head now for the rest of the tattoo, and I'll just be able to do that really quickly and easily and remember that I dipped two particular colours together to create that one. Or I'll forget and I'll just figure it out again, which is fine. But when you're working in sections and you're doing like this particular colour for a little while, you shouldn't really have to worry about that, unless for some reason maybe later on you decide to come back and maybe you might need to saturate it a tiny bit more, or you might want to put a bit of a darker colour over the top of it. or a lighter colour over the top of it, which can be done depending what it is. Light colours are actually quite strong because they've usually got quite a heavy white base in them. And white is like really good at going over things, which sounds like it shouldn't be, but it does. I think that when you dip in your colours into each other, sometimes it's quite obvious what colour you're going to make, but depending on how the ink is mixed, they can have colours that you don't think as their base, and they'll make a colour that you weren't expecting. So it is always good to check before you do that. Like, it is good to have a knowledge of colour theory, but sometimes depending on the ink that you're dipping into, it might not work out how you think. But you'll normally be quite close in the ballpark if you've got sort of just a basic understanding. Some sections, like this little bit of the shirt, I'll maybe almost slightly over exaggerate these little creases in the collar more than they are on the picture. For different reasons on different occasions. Like, I might want to do it a bit darker so that I know that it holds during the healing process and then the aging process after. Or you might choose to do it to make something a little bit more obvious that that's what it is. You can always soften things out later to some degree if you're careful, but you shouldn't do things just for the sake of it. I think sometimes you get going with tattooing and you just go a little bit loopy, and you sort of get a bit carried away, is probably the word that I'm after, and you start doing stuff. I know I have done that on occasion, and you just think, yeah, this bit of shade in here will make it look better. It's like, what the fuck are you putting that there for? Like, you're just enjoying getting all the colours out and having a blast, but it does need to make sense. And if you ever feel like you are getting a bit like that and a bit carried away, just stop and have a break for a minute and reset yourself and come back with a nice fresh head on. So I'm not tattooing this area very heavily. So although there is a decent amount of saturation, it's not undergone too much trauma, because this is where I'm going to come back later with white and maybe like an off-white colour. I'm going to put those into the spaces that I'm leaving, and also just straight up over the top in some areas. And then, so going back to that, I'm a messy tattoo artist and I'm always getting ink everywhere. I will wait till later to do that, whereas there are artists out there that'll just do it now and it'll stay super clean the whole tattoo and they don't have to worry about it. But I do, and that's why I do it this way. So it's always important for you yourself to find your way. You might be that super clean tattoo artist that never gets ink anywhere. So if you are, you might as well just do it now. Just trying to define this area a little bit more, because I don't think that the shadow is as obvious as I want it to be. And then we're probably going to move on from this area. I always think with the way that I personally tattoo things and I come back to different sections, that I can be doing a portrait and like 80% of the duration of it, you could almost look at it and be like, what the hell is going on? Like I'm just doing it totally wrong. And then you get to that last sort of 20%, 10% of it, and you start putting your light colours in and your highlights, and it's like, oh, like there it is, that's what I've been doing. So again, just try not to stress yourself out and just do what you're doing. So that's the section earlier that I put that little underlay of black in. and now I'm putting a pretty dark brown over the top of that. I just think when you put particularly black in that way, it can kind of make your final colour look a little bit more naturally shadowed, or a bit sort of muckier maybe is a good word, when you're doing things like this and you want it to look a bit dirty and a bit creepy, rather than just straight up brown. When you sort of choose colours for tattooing, like if maybe you're doing a rose, a blue rose for example, you're going to pick out a light blue, a medium blue and a dark blue more than likely, but in reality that rose and all of its petals are exactly the same blue, each one, but it's the way that the shadow lays across them that makes them look darker. And I think when you use black to show shadow, it kind of looks more realistic, because shadow is just darkness. Getting your contrast right is important, because they are often quite dark photos. I think portraits in general follow roughly the same rules, but I think particularly with things like horror, or maybe a portrait that's got blood splatters and things like that on it, they almost free you up a little bit more to be a little bit more expressive with it. But I don't think there's a real right or wrong way to approach one. Some people in that situation would maybe do the blood splats first, and then lay the flesh tone on top of it, because it won't really affect the blood splats, whereas some people will kind of do the blood splats after, or other people will literally tattoo around the blood splats, which I think is really difficult to get a good saturation when you do that. But I think that you just have a bit more freedom with horror, to maybe do your own thing with it a bit. Like if someone gives you a portrait of just a straight up person, you kind of need to make it look as close to that person as you can. Whereas, like I've done quite a lot of ghost face tattoos, and I've done a blue one, a pink one, a rainbow one, a purple one. I'll just choose my own colour to go with on them, which I think is nice. And again with this, I can kind of go a little bit off base with the colour choices for the mask and stuff, as long as it's following the general rule of the photo. But I think you can use more hard edges in horror work. It does really depend on the picture itself when it comes down to it, but I think you are free to have a bit more of your own take on the piece when it's something like this. Whereas if you get asked to do like a portrait of a family member, there's generally no way of doing anything different on that. You're kind of going to be wanted to do that exactly like it looks. And I think that the main differences between realism and maybe more cartoony styles are that you're not generally putting line work on it. Once you've got your line work on a sort of fun cartoony piece, you don't have to really worry about your stencil too much anymore. So you can kind of approach it whichever side or way you want to from there. I think that a lot of techniques that are used in realism come from all of the, maybe the earlier things that you'd learn when you're tattooing. So sort of new school kind of work taught me how to pack my colours really solid. And I feel like you have a little bit of freedom with realism to do what you want to do a little bit. I think that there's the technical side of it is quite similar really. It's just putting a lot of small techniques from different styles together to achieve something. So a lot of people, when they start learning tattooing, will learn sort of more traditional styles, and that is going to teach you how to line really well. It's going to teach you how to pack colours really well and how to blend colours as well. And then when you get round to realism, all of those things are used for it as well, just in maybe less bold ways. I think, I mean, I know that some people do, but I think it's good to learn a few styles when you start out tattooing, rather than just being like, I am going to be a realism artist and straight up learning realism, because like I was saying earlier, I do use line work in realism, but not a lot. Like, it's not like if you're a trad artist, you are going to be lining every piece. And you're going to get really good at lining as well because you're doing it often. If you just straight up learn realism, I feel like you can kind of miss out some skills that are nice to have in your set. And there might be a particular piece that you get asked to tattoo that does actually require a lot of line work, and if you've never bothered to learn how to do it, you might really struggle. It's good to know how to do everything, or a little bit of everything at least, because you might not be lucky enough to tattoo things like this all the time. I know that I don't get to do it every day. And as fun as it all is, it is a job. So it's nice to have all the tools that you need to be able to take on a variety of work. So I'm using the Stella 2.0 cartridges today, and I really like these needles because they are super sharp and they're really stable, which I think helps reduce the trauma and the time that has to be spent in the skin. And they're colour coded as well. You can also see what your configuration is on the top there, which just makes things a bit easier and a bit more straightforward when you're trying to concentrate on other things. I'm moving into like a new section now, so I'm going to go back to what I was doing at the beginning and just put some black in and just again keep going in that manner. And then I'll probably choose his little cute ear here, and we'll do that bit and then move on from there again. I'm not going to go like all the way up the hair right now, but I am just going to kind of leave it with a little softened edge there, so when I get round to doing it I can blend back into that rather than it potentially getting a bit of a hard edge on it while it's sitting there as I'm doing the rest. I'm just using the edge of my mag to put these little edges and small shapes in, rather than using the full length of it because it is too wide. But again, if you're not confident in using the edge of your mag like that, just switch down to a smaller one. I do think when you swap to a smaller mag from a larger one, that might be where you could choose to change the voltage of your machine, maybe. But I generally do all of that with my sort of hand pressure rather than changing what the machine itself is set at. But sometimes you do have to. But I pretty much use this injector like it comes out of the box. It's got the same cam on it, which is a 3.25mm one. But I swapped out the drive bar for, I think it's called the carbon bar, so it's got no give in it at all. They do come with a hard bar. It's a black plastic one, but this one's like a metal one, which for me just helps me feel what I'm doing with my hands more. That's how I like that to be. But they're really great machines because of that system. What they include, the cam bars that you get with them all have a different hardness, and depending on which way you sort of twist it and face it, you can, it's pretty much unlimited what you can do with it and how you can make your machine hit. Which I don't even think any other machines come with things like that. Obviously you can swap your cams on some, or you just straight up have to buy a whole other machine if you want a different stroke. And just again on this ear, just kind of picking out those really dark areas, getting those in, and then any really light parts I'm just going to save them for later. I'll kind of come back to those sections, putting a little tiny bit of red into this brown, which it's not having a massive effect on the colour. It's just knocking off how dark it is just a bit, and I think red is the colour that I'm going to end up using to put some hues into it and make it a little bit unique along the way. A lot of red inks are brown based in tattooing, so they should blend together really nicely and give it a realistic look at the end. I really like the effect that you get when you kind of whip your machine and you get the sort of the grain and the stagger of the needle, but I don't think it looks right on realism generally. I do like to get that sort of grainy effect sometimes though when I put my white in at the end, just because it's essentially an extra little texture on the piece. But I think that word is quite relative to realism texture. You tend to want to get a good texture on horror pieces especially. I mean, this guy is wearing dead people on his face, so he's not got the best skin routine, which means again you can have a bit of fun with your tattoo and not drive yourself mad with it. You can even add some extra textures and things like that if that's what you want to do to it. But I tend to lay quite a lot of my highlights over what I've done, so I sort of make quite a few of those decisions more towards the end of the piece. But I'm pretty happy with the colours that I'm using at the moment, so I'm gonna stick with that throughout the piece now. They're quite fleshy, which he should be pretty fleshy. But I'm just upping the sort of saturation a little bit on the colours themselves. I think that's a confusing word when you're tattooing, because you talk about saturating, which is getting the skin saturated and fully packed with ink, but obviously saturated is a word that describes colour as well. But rather than it being quite grey and gloomy, I'm gonna try and give it a bit more of a saturated look to it and a bit more of a brightness. So here I'm not saturating quite as thoroughly as I have been with my black. I want all of these colours now to have a bit of a soft edge to them, so I can continue blending without too many hard edges. And then if I need to put a hard edge on something, I can. You do generally want these things to look quite soft. I think that that's enough on that ear for now, so the rest of that's going to be generally lighter. But before I do any light highlights and light colours later, I will just check the contrast and definition and how dark it is and correct anything like that once I've got a better idea of what the piece is looking like, because although I'm aware of what I'm doing, that is just I mean, it's an ear what I've done, but you don't know that that's an ear until it's attached to the rest of his face, because he's all fucked up looking. So when more of the piece is done, you can get a bit of a better understanding of what you want the rest of it to look like. And maybe some sections that you have done, you can decide that you would like it to be a little bit darker and make those changes before you start doing your light things. So from there, I think I'm going to just do these sort of neck folds, and then I think I'll do his mouth next, because there's quite a bit of black in there, and then again I'll work up to the mouth after I've done the mouth and keep going like that. And again, I'm constantly checking my photo and looking at the stencil that I've got overlaid on it, because we're getting into sort of an area where there's lots of little shapes and paths to follow, and I'm using black again, so you better get it right. There's some of these bits on the reference aren't necessarily black, but I'm just going to kind of up the contrast on that side of the portrait a bit to make it a bit more obvious and help it not be as flat. Sometimes things look really good in photographs or on pictures, but they may not always translate in the best way to tattooing, or just making a small change like that can just make it look a bit better as a tattoo. Ultimately, I think in any style of tattooing and any tattoo, your black is your big hitter on the eyes. People really notice black. I think if you don't have any, you don't have a lot of contrast or definition in your piece. I mean, there are some things that people will be tattooing that they just don't have any black in, and maybe they shouldn't, but your white highlights will look super, super white against black. Whereas if you don't have any, they're not going to hold as much of a brightness to them, because they're not against their total opposite. So it all matters, and it all has a reason and a point to be there. So this is starting to get quite tight now around these teeth and inside this mouth with this 15 mag, so this might be where I size down a little bit rather than struggling. I'm going to go for an 11 now, and I think when you sort of go maybe 7 and below, they're just very sharp and they're quite square, and I'm just personally not very good at using them. Or again, you might find that that's the exact thing that you want to use, and you shouldn't not use what you're comfortable with to try and be what someone else is, because I don't think that's how you achieve that, and you shouldn't be someone else anyway. Getting into tattooing is a little bit of a funny thing, because a lot of people will tell you a lot of different things, and they're probably not all wrong, they're probably all right. Something that I think is good to do is have a decent range of work in your portfolio, and build a portfolio if you don't have one, because people are going to want to see if you can draw and what your skill level is. And I think if you include a lot of different work in there, it can show that you've got sort of diversity. And I think when you start tattooing, I remember when I started, I was like, yeah, I'm going to be like Paul Acker and I'm going to tattoo horror portraits all the time and do it. And it's like, you can't just learn how to do that. So I'd drawn loads of, you know, movie portraits and all sorts of things like that. And when I was kind of going around with my portfolio, it was weird things that were getting pointed out that I wasn't expecting. You know, I thought people would go, whoa, fucking hell, that's well cool. You know, like my Halloween portraits and stuff. But the things that stopped them were I'd drawn a really nice rose straight up. I just drew it because I was like, I should have a rose in here. And it was, everyone that saw my portfolio pointed out the rose. Which I'm guessing is because people really like roses, and you are going to be tattooing roses when you start. Once you've learned the basics anyway. And something else that stood out in my portfolio, I drew a portrait of Amanda from Saw with a bear trap on, but I coloured it all in green, so like a monochromatic, and that got pointed out a lot as well, just I think because it, like with black and grey and using just one single colour to create a piece, it shows that you understand contrast and shadow, and you know those are the important things about art. I think is just the understanding of it. So even if you don't necessarily have the most incredible skill in art, if you can understand it and you know what you're looking at, that's where getting good at it comes from. So I would say to spend your time drawing simple shapes as well, like, you know, draw a circle and then colour it in and add a shadow and the correct shading to make it look like it's 3D and that it's sat on the paper. Things like that, especially if you want to become a more realistic tattooer. Those are what it's all about. You just put those skills together, and then you're doing realism. They're just all little techniques added together. But I think you should also get tattooed. You don't have to have tattoos to be a good artist. I know that's another conversation, but I think it helps you get to know maybe an artist that you admire, so you can be, you know, in close quarters with them and talk to them and build a bit of a friendship. And I feel like that's more how you get an apprenticeship than just straight up walking in and getting super lucky. It's all about who you know, and it can be really helpful. It also teaches you what getting tattooed feels like, so when you're tattooing someone else, you can at least appreciate how they might be feeling right now, and I think that's good to know. And otherwise, just don't give up, because it was a right pain in the ass for me. But you'll get there if you really want to do it. And if you know you want to do it at a young age, definitely stick to it, because you're not going to be getting paid when you start. So if you're not lucky enough to maybe live with your parents, or in a situation where you can support yourself while doing it, it can be a bit of a bugger. When I started, I worked at Pets at Home, And I also worked at Game, so I had 2 jobs and this. So there were no days off. And I had to stay in those jobs, you know, until I'd acquired enough sort of knowledge and skill to be allowed let loose on, you know, paying customers. And again, if you are older and, you know, this is something you decided you wanted to do, it's not too late. Just do it. Because there's thousands of people that want to do this job because it's the coolest job on the planet, but they're also lazy buggers and they'll give up. And if you don't give up, then you'll get the job. You just gotta want it more than the person next to you. So this bit on the picture, his shadow above his teeth is actually not as dark as the shadow on his lip, which for me doesn't make sense because that's deeper into his mouth. So I am going to just darken it a little bit because I feel like that might just be like an artifact on the photo. And again, that's just remembering what you're tattooing and what it more than likely looks like. And regardless of whether that was the right thing to do or not, it is still going to look good. So again, don't drive yourself mad trying to get every tiny little thing exactly like it looks, because no one's going to be walking around with the reference for this next to it. So as long as it looks great, just getting some fleshier colours now, because we're actually on his actual face underneath the mask now. They are quite similar to the colours that are used on the mask, but I would like them to look a little bit cleaner just to exaggerate the fact that this is living flesh here and this is made out of dead people. Which that's sort of going back to what I was talking about earlier about the colours don't have to match one for one as long as what you're doing makes sense. So I'm kind of using like my sort of cleaner looking flesh tones now that I would use on a normal portrait of a person. And again, if I want to mucky them up, I'll be able to do that later. I'm going to get some pinky colours now for his lips. Which again, things like lips, I always end up mixing colours to get the shade for lips because I'm sure there does exist the exact colour that I want straight out of a bottle, but I don't have it, so I'm making my own. And I'll dip a little bit of red into a fleshy colour to create a pink, but I will never just use a pink out of a bottle because they're too pink. Unless the person is wearing lipstick, they just look too cartoony, I think, and we're not trying to achieve that. I've always got on my sort of side on my palette, I have a few pots of black poured out. One of them is not to be touched with other colours, so it just remains black. And then the other 2 blacks, or 2 or 3 blacks that I have there for me to dip my colours into and just dirty them up a little bit. And I'll also have a medium grey and maybe a light greyer side for the same reasons, just to knock some colours and take that really pretty colour out of them, to keep things a bit more realistic. And I'll also have something like, today I've got a colour called Foundation Flesh poured out, and I doubt I'm actually going to use that for any of the flesh tones on this piece, but it's really good to dip colours into to lighten them up, like brighten them up, rather than using white, because white will just lighten the colour that you've got but keep it exactly the same. But sometimes you might want to just get a little bit more of a saturated look to that colour. So if you use a colour like foundation flesh, or even a yellow sometimes is quite good for that. So I just basically have a few pots aside specifically for dipping my colours into, and although I've got a pretty good knowledge of colour theory, I'm not a master, so I'll just dip in and out of them, and I might dip into one and think it's absolute crap, and then I'll just wash the needle and dip into a different colour until I get it right. And then over time, when you're using the same brand of ink for so long, you will find colours that you just constantly always go into and wanting to use, and they'll be like a staple in your sort of general palette. But I find that with realism there's so many different colours that can be used, but I'm usually using ones that I've not used in a while, or maybe never even used at all. So much like starting with the black and experimenting a little bit, there is a lot of that going on with the colours as I'm going, until I find what I want to use. So like that bit of his lip at the bottom, I'm going to dip the colours that I have been using for his lips into some grey, which is probably going to make it a tiny bit purpley, but the idea behind it is that I'm using the same colour for his lips, because your lips are the same colour all over, except we're just going to create a bit of a shadow using that lip colour. But I think that's why mixing your colours is good with realism, because you can have like 10 pots of green aside, but depending on what their base is, they won't go together. Some of them are like really yellow based and they don't match the palette properly. So if you, rather than trying to have a different green for every section of, maybe if you're tattooing like the Hulk or something, if you have maybe 3 or 4 at most, and then you knock them into other colours to alter them a bit. Like I have my greys and my foundation flesh aside for doing that with, so that they're still made with the same base, so they should match. And teeth are a funny one with realism, because you always want to do on white, but again you run that risk of them looking a bit cartoony when you do them white. So I'll tend to pick like a light colour rather than a white, and maybe just put a highlight on them. And not many people's teeth are actually white. Again, you just don't want things to look like cartoon characters. And then you can just put a little white highlight on at the end to give them a little shine or a sheen. With those two teeth, I've pretty much just used some grey and some brown. And they may need to be a little bit darker than that because they need to look like they're sunken into his mouth. So I'm just going to brush gently over. And then now that I've done that mouth, I'm kind of just going to work around this jaw and cheek before I move on to the next section. So because I'm putting a tone in that I haven't actually done yet, I'm just going to be careful with it and make sure that it does look like I want it to look like before I go mad and start diving into the rest of it. But I quite like the way that's looking, so I will stick to that. I tend to overlap my edges as I'm working so that everything's blended, but you don't want to do it too much because you're technically tattooing things twice when you're doing that, which that's where you can start to get a bit of trauma. And again, I'm getting to a colour that I haven't used yet, so I'm just gonna have a little experiment and make sure that I like what I've got. which these are quite, I guess, quite creamy colours now. They're quite close to the skin colour that I'm actually working on, which I think sometimes people would say not to colour something if it's very close to the colour of the natural skin that you're working on, but I do like to fully saturate my pieces top to bottom, because if they're naughty and they take their tattoos into the sun, then that skin colour's not going to be the same as it was. With any tattoo, if you can moisturise them every day, it will lengthen the time that they last, because it's on your skin, so if you look after your skin, by default the tattoo gets looked after and will last longer. But the sun is the main worry, particularly with colour tattoos, because the colours can change when they get tanned. I've seen some people out there with like tattoos that were flesh coloured and they've gone purple, so now they've got like a purple face on their leg. And with black and grey, if you get quite a heavy tan, because you often use the skin tone as your highlight, you're losing your highlight the darker that your skin tone gets through being tanned. So the worst thing you can do is sit out in the sun all day. And if you must, then you should put sun cream on. And remember to apply it every 2 hours as well, because it doesn't last all day. But I'm a very indoorsy person and I get burnt, so you don't have to worry about that with me. But yeah, you should always have a good moisturiser for your tattoos and continue to use it after they've healed. Another great product for looking after your tattoos beyond the healing process is Hustle Butter's stick and lotion that they've just released. And they're literally designed for that purpose, and they will keep your tattoos looking brand new and fresh. So you need to go and check that out. This stick is especially good for that because you can just chuck it in your bag and wipe it on whenever you need it. So it's really, really easy to use. So if you've got that, there's no excuses. So I'm getting back to like bigger areas now, so I'm going to swap back to my bigger mag. I was getting carried away then, but then I noticed that it wasn't saturating, and then now my typical sort of hand speed and movement that I do in these bigger areas is doing what I want it to do again. Which I think when you've been tattooing for a while, a lot of it's almost just muscle memory and habit and stuff. But I am always looking for weaknesses and being open-minded about what I hear other people saying and trying little things here and there, because I do think that if you get to a point where you aren't willing to learn anymore, or maybe you just think there's nothing for you to learn, that's when the absolute horde of extremely hungry kids behind you surpass you as an artist. There's so many people that want to do what we're doing. You've got to keep learning and keep pushing and try and make each tattoo you do the best one you've done, even if it's just a section of it that you think, I'm going to do that again on all of my pieces from now. So this part of the picture's really, really dark, and you can make out that there's like a bit of a fold in the neck here, but I'm just going to make it a tiny bit more obvious in my colour choice so that it does stand out enough, because when they get really dark you can't really tell. Which again is me going back to that, you should tattoo what you see, and I see this, but I might just be exaggerating it slightly just so it holds up when the piece is healed. So that's a little bit lighter than it needs to be there. And because I've sort of come round this way, I've gotten back to this ear now, so I am gonna do this black in this section so that I don't run the risk of work that I've done so far. Because it's on an edge, I'm just going to wipe it this way now, so that we're just keeping it away from what's been done. I haven't done any super light colours yet, so it shouldn't really dirty them, but I think it's just good to practice what you're doing all the time, even if you don't need to. And if you ever are sort of doing darker or black parts when you've already done your light, then you can dab instead of wiping. So I'm just using the edge of my mag there just to get that little edge, and then I'm going to turn it back to the flat, larger side now to fill in this area. That's why I tend to use this size mag, because it just lets me do a lot, and I'm comfortable using it for that. So I wouldn't, even though that is quite a relatively straight edge, I wouldn't suggest using a liner and putting that line in, because a liner will saturate much darker than a mag will, because the needles are more condensed. And so what you'll probably find you'll be left with is like a really dark black line there, and then a slightly lighter shade of black next to it. And you can saturate extremely black with a mag, but I just think you can notice it a little bit, and if you're being a perfectionist, then you'll spot it and you'll be annoyed that you did it. I remember I was blacking out one of my best friend's arms, and I wrote Rob was here on it in a liner, and then I blacked it out, and when it healed it said Rob was here through the black, so lessons learned. And I tried to be gentle with that liner as well, because I had a little inkling that it might do that. But I don't know if it's a massive factor, but because I try to just use the roughly the same size mag throughout the whole piece, I think I achieve the same level of saturation throughout the whole piece as well, rather than some areas maybe being a bit more solidly packed because they were with a tighter mag and stuff. So I had to around that mouth before, but generally everything should heal the same. The trauma caused to the skin should be roughly the same all over, but you do need to keep track of where you're tattooing as you're doing it, because from the lower ankle where we started to here, this skin is starting to get fleshier and softer, and that's where you're going to need to start to increase your stretch on the skin and make sure that you are saturating as you were. And so this little piece that I'm about to get to doesn't really look like much on that photo, but that is definitely meant to be his hair, so I'm going to kind of take my mag and try and keep that a bit thinner and a bit lighter and maybe slightly fluffier than the rest. And again, on the picture it's got like some bit of brown on it, but that's just because it's an old photo, so you can make these decisions yourself. And I think it's definitely worth bearing in mind when you're working on people with different complexions that colours, I find that they can, as they're put in right now, they can look exactly the same, but sort of over that healing process they can just maybe dull ever so slightly or not appear as bright as they were. So I think there is a little bit of experiment and a bit of learning involved in that, and you do need to think about it. Some colours in particular don't like to stay as they were. White ink can become a little bit more of a yellowy colour, which is quite a big topic. And I think where you can, it's good to get photos of work you've done on different tones of skin and try and maybe build yourself a bit of a portfolio where you can show healed and fresh, so you can help explain what's likely to happen to your client. And I think sometimes tattoos can benefit from a second pass as well, so some colours might dull, but if you tattoo that colour twice, it's I always describe it as like painting the walls at home. You know, your first coat might not quite be your desired result, but as soon as you get the second coat on, it makes a difference. So I think in some cases that's something to consider as well. So I'm going to fill in this right side of the cheek now, which is quite dark and straightforward, really. I'm just going to try and keep a soft edge to each part that I do, so I can blend the colours together smoothly. I don't want really any sharp bits on this because there aren't any on the picture, and it is a cheek, so don't think it should have anything too textured on it. But I will later just add some little textures, like little pock marks maybe, or just a little something. But I do think that with art in general, and you know, movie posters and things like that, you've generally got like a focal point where your eyes will draw to straight away, and if you overload your tattoo or your picture or whatever you're doing with too many details and too many points, the person's eyes that are viewing it for the first time will almost like struggle to look at it. And I think it's the difference between when you see a picture and you instantly go whoa, to seeing a picture and having to really think about it while you're looking at it. I think if you have to think too much, then I'm not saying it's a bad picture, but I just think you want that initial amazement. And I think if you've got too much going on, that's where that happens. So like the sides of your portrait, unless there's something specifically interesting going on there that needs to be put in, you know, keep them simple, and then obviously be careful how much detail you add in later with your highlights and stuff, because your eyes are also drawn to the highlighted parts. But yeah, I think with him, he's got no eyes, so I'm gonna use the mouth area for that, and he's got some cracks in his mask up here, so I'm probably gonna maybe put a bit of extra sort of time and detail into those sections to just give your eyes an immediate something to look at. Just using a little bit more of a saturated colour on this bit, because again it does look like that on the picture, but also it will add to the fact that this side of the face is in shadow, because the rest of the colours won't be as saturated as that. So again, I'm kind of approaching like a new section, so I'm going back to the black. It's not quite as black as this on the picture, but I'm doing a tattoo, not a photo, so I'm going to just increase the darkness so that we've got some contrast and some good definition, which essentially should make his nose look like it's more lifted off when we get to that point. Again, just keeping the edges pretty soft. Nothing on this really has a sort of a rock solid edge, apart from the sides of his mouth, which I have kept them quite sharp. And inside his nostril I'm going to go black, and then on the edges of the outside on it I'm going to use my darkest brown, maybe just lay a little gentle bit of black there just to keep it ever so slightly darker than the plain brown. This is such a dark brown though that may be unnecessary to do that. once I've got these eyes coloured in, that's kind of me done with black for quite a while. I kind of get on with the details that I've been leaving open, and a little bit less stress going on with worrying about where your excess black ink's gonna wipe to, and play around with the colour a bit more. And I'll probably tattoo this up to the point of the eyes fully, and then I will leave the forehead reasonably empty. I'll kind of put the main big details in, and then I'll do the hair because the hair's black, so I've got a good break between the hair and the face that's already been coloured in, so I can do that a little bit more safely. Which a lot of these things that I do are just down to preference more than anything. I don't think you have to be doing it exactly like I do, but it does work for me, and it helps me stay on track with what I'm trying to do, and it gives me a bit of a goal to work towards with each section, and feel like I've hit a little milestone each bit. So I am just going to get this nose done, and then we're pretty much done all of our base up to the eyes, and I'm going to dive into the hair, get all that mapped out, and then we will do the forehead after that, and then we can get to the fun bits and do all the highlights. On this section I've got my mag turned on its side, so I'm kind of heavily saturating the bottom edge, but the top edge of it will feather out and be quite soft, which is just the way that I've learnt to do that. But again, you could just use a smaller mag and continue tattooing it like you have been throughout, but I like to use the edges of them for that reason in particular, that I can kind of get a harder, sharper edge on the bottom of the mag and a softer, lighter edge at the top. And I actually do quite a bit of my shading sort of sidewards rather than pushing forwards, and I find that sometimes I can get a bit of a smoother result from doing it. So as you can see, I'm just blending my colours together in this area, and the best way to do that is to leave a soft edge after each colour, and also you can dip your current colour into the last colour you use slightly just to continue it a bit, then clean your needle and come back with the fresh colour, so you're getting a slow, smooth blend. I am still running my machine at the same voltage as when I started. I don't find that I need to change it too often, although when I start doing the little highlights later, that might be where I decide to slow it down a little bit if I feel like the skin's sort of had enough already, and it'll help just make the process a little bit easier. But throughout the whole tattoo, I am trying to keep my sort of the weight of my hand light, so that although we are saturating quite heavily, it's not hard. I'm just gonna pick a few sections of this forehead out that are quite important features and just mark them in before I move on to the hair, and take a little bit of the risk of losing any of the important part of the stencil. And the forehead's got like a crack in it, so I am going to use like a round shader now, just to give it a little bit of a harder edge. So when I start to smooth lighter shades over it later, this will kind of resist those colours and it'll still stand off the skin quite well. And I'm using this exactly the same as I would use my mag, in terms of the pressure and the hand speed, and just kind of easing it in and checking it before I continue. I kind of want it to be a little bit erratic in the movement, so it's got a bit of a texture and a bit of a, not a super clean look to it. And I'm just going to kind of whip out here, because I don't want it to have a really hard edge on it, but I do want that to be nice and saturated as much as possible. And then I'm going to get a 5 round liner, and I'm just going to put the stitching of his mask in with this, because it's quite a tight detail and it's much easier to do it with this than using a mag. And the round shader is just a little bit too thick. This is like quite a tight 5, so it is quite a thin line that you'll get. And again, I'm not being overly neat with this, because it's stitching, it's not a perfect line, and I'm going to leave little bits so it's not quite as strong as the rest, so that when I start doing the light shading on the forehead later, I can almost just tattoo on top of it and almost knock down the darkness of these lines, so it looks like it's catching the light. I do make sure that I'm stretching the skin properly when I'm using anything like a liner, just so you can get in and out, and where you need your lines to be straight, you know that they are going in straight. So those are probably the most key little features of that forehead, and they've been marked on now, so I'm gonna just get this side of the face done, and then I'll get into the hair. And I like to do the hair before I finish the face as well, because I feel like you can get a little bit, you can almost start to think that the hair isn't that important. And when you get towards the end of a piece and you're a little bit tired and your client's a little bit tired, I feel like you can almost start to speed up and just try and get it done. And really, if you start it a bit before you're due to finish, you can spend a bit more time making it look nice and just leaving some spaces and places for highlights. This portrait doesn't have the nicest hair on it in terms of it being nice and styled, but there is room to do highlights and nice little features on it, so I'm going to tackle them next. So we're back to straight black now, and again tattooing it in the same way that I have been from the beginning, so small circles, and then check that it is saturated, and if it is, continue. And I will likely do most of this hair with the mag. I might get that little 5 liner out again to put some little single strands of hair in, but it's quite a messy haircut, so we don't want to make him look too dapper. I think if I was doing a neater hairstyle, I'd try to keep my mag angled at roughly the same direction throughout all of it, so that the grain and things are all going in the same way. But this is quite a scruffy hairdo, so it is okay to change the angle of your your mag and go at it from different ways, however you need to. But on the edges of the hair here, I'm kind of just gently whipping that out, just so it doesn't have a super solid edge on it. I'm just using that edge of my mag again, so you can get a really thin little streak with it. I'm basically just going to work, I think I'll do both sides and then meet in the middle with this. And do all the black, and then put some grey and some white highlights in that to finish it off. So I'm just continuing with my black in the hair, and I'm just putting some little strands of hair in with my little 5 liner, because the curves are a little bit too tight for me to use my mag for that. So we're just getting some shapes and some texture to the hair, and I've been leaving little spaces along the way so I can put some grey shading in there and give them a little shine. My favourite bit of tattooing is coming up soon, which is where I've tattooed enough that my stencil doesn't matter anymore, and I can just do what I want and not worry about saving it. Which I use stencil stuff because it is really strong and it does hold, but as you might have noticed, I am quite messy, so it takes a lot to withstand me. And I'm just kind of doing little whips with this needle, so I'm going in reasonably deep at the start, and then I'm just sliding it out of the skin, so it's as the movement continues, there's less and less depth of the needle. I think I'm going to go back to my mag now. I'm not being neat now because this is just all scruffy, tangled up hair, so the less uniform the better really. But when I do get to the edges where I was flicking out with my liner not long ago, I am just going to do the same with my mag. I don't want it to be too rock solid, so it does have a somewhat of a fuzzy or soft look to it. And I do try to stick to my stencil and photograph as much as I can with hair, but I do kind of just make this up a little bit as I go now. You can get stuck for absolutely hours on hair if you're trying to do it exactly like it, and sometimes you should, but this is just messy, scruffy, tangled hair, so we're going to make it look messy and scruffy and tangled. I'm just swapping to grey now, and I'm just going to fill some of these areas that I left with this grey, and slightly going over my black just to blend it together a little bit, and then the remaining spaces I will use white and just pick out some of those shiny little features that hair has. Now I'm back to the forehead, so get those darkest bits in and then move to the light as we go. I'm putting these sections in at a reasonably good pace because I don't want them to be mega saturated, because this is quite a large open space and I want to be able to go into these colours a little bit with the lighter colour. If they're too heavy and saturated, it won't really go over it very well. Whereas this little flick here, that is the shadow of the hair above, so I am going to kind of carve that out properly because I do want that to keep its shape. So I'm going a little bit further in than I maybe at a glance need to with this colour, because I'm going to go right over that with my lightest shades at the end. So I'm not tattooing this too vigorously. It's quite a greeny colour, but I think that is what rotting flesh might look like a little bit. I've just rolled the client over a bit, and I completely forgot to do this bit of the collar, so I'm going to do that now before we carry on. Just getting too carried away. And then once this bit's done, we're kind of going to go to our whites and brights, which before I do those, I always put a little extra helping of hustle butter on my client and just let it soak in for 5 minutes or so, because it does take the edge off. When you get to the white highlights, the reason that people always say it's the worst and it hurts the most, it's got nothing to do with the ink. It all feels the same in that sense, but because we're going back inside where we've already tattooed or very close to it, your skin's just pissed off. And it just feels way worse. And the colour white specifically, I feel like for most people they find it much harder to actually get it into the skin, so they will have to tattoo a little bit harder than normal. I certainly do, just out of habit and making sure that I get it in effectively first time, rather than having to mess about and, you know, upset my lovely clients more than I have to with it. But if you got just a white tattoo, it would just feel the same as getting any old tattoo. It's nothing to do with the actual colour. And I'm just brushing here rather than circling because it's quite a blank area, so I just want it to be soft and don't need to really get any textures on that part. But I am going to do some little edges of this collar here again. Just going to add a little tiny edge of the shoulder there. Nothing too much, but just so we're not having that bit of cord. That's how it stops, so we can give it a little bit of a soft edge. But I'm not going to take it very far because we've got more portraits to fit on this leg, so if we can not sacrifice too much skin, we've got more room. And then what I'd normally do once I've got two portraits that are next to each other is I'll either continue the reference on if it's something worth doing, and if it's not, then we'll find a nice background, whether that's like some nice colours, or whether maybe the backdrop of him is skulls and things on the walls. So you could do those. Well, that's a problem for another day. And again, I'm just going to brush this down so it's not got as much of a hard edge on it. And then again, when we get to sort of final stages of this lower leg, we've got room to decide exactly what we want to do, or if we're happy with it having just a soft finish. So, nice good spray with the bubbles, because it's really good at just getting these excess bits of ink off the skin that may have dried on or are just a bit stubborn. And it feels nice and it's soothing. And then I'm just going to put a reasonably good amount of hustle butter over this tattoo and just let it rest in it for a few minutes and just take some of that sting out before we get to the serious stuff. We've done most of the tattoo now, so it's ready for the lightest shades and my white highlights, and I'm going to do just a little bit of background next to the side just to give it a little pop of colour. We're basically just cutting into really everything that we've done so far, just softly putting those lighter highlights in. So every little space that I left is going to have something in it when I've done this, and then I'll put trims of white over this. So you do need to be reasonably effective and in and out of the skin as quickly as you can, just so you're not causing any unnecessary trauma. And I'm just dipping some of it into my white just to lighten it more so before I then put the white in. And again, I'm not going to take this background too far because we've got more work to do on this leg in future, so we don't want to tattoo and then have to compromise the next piece because we took the background too far out. I'm just doing a little bit just so we can see a little bit of a different colour on the piece because it's a very fleshy brown piece. And the other good thing about putting a little bit of background is it does just seal that portrait in, so where you've used some more fleshy colours on the edges, it will help it stand off against the skin. So now I'm just going to go into all the little spaces and add nice little white markings and textures and highlights. Some areas I'll put a little bit more than is maybe necessary in terms of the reference, but I think it helps the actual tattoo as a finished product. And I like the white to look quite textured when I can, either by whipping quite quickly with your mag to get that grainy look to it, or by sort of not colouring in completely solid with your liner or your round shader. I like to use the liner because it's quite tight and it's quite sharp, so it will lay that white on top of what I've done if there's any areas where I wish I'd have left a little bit extra space, or where I just want to do some little markings over the top. Put these markings in quite solidly around the edge of that seam where he's sewn his mask together, just to make it a little bit more obvious that that is what it is from a distance. So I've just swapped to a 9 mag. It's because usually the smaller the mag, the better it is at saturating, because it's got a smaller surface area. And I'm doing that just to make sure that it goes over what I've tattooed effectively, so I'm not having to keep going over it and upsetting the skin in these final stages. And I'm just brushing this hair with the edge of the mag just to give some little slices of white rather than patches of white, just just to help give it that effect of somehow. And I spotted a little something on my way there that I want to put in now, which is just a little lip on his eyebrow, which I'd left space for this before. And this part was a cut, so I'm going to put a little strong edge of white on that, like I did around the seams of the mask. So even though it doesn't necessarily have that on the photo, because I've done it on the seams to show an edge, I also want to show an edge here. If you use the same technique, it will make you think that it is the same look. So when you get to your white highlights and you're filling white in, it is notorious for being quite a difficult colour. And if you are someone that's struggling with it, one of the main things that I can tell you to do is obviously be very deliberate in what you're doing. You need to be, you can't be too gentle with white. You also need to know the limit of how thorough you can be before you're doing damage that you shouldn't be doing. If it's bleeding and you're not sure if it's saturated, just honestly leave it alone and just move through your piece. Let the skin settle down, because it is hard to tell whether a colour's fully saturated when it's got blood pouring through it, and white is the worst colour for blood affecting it because blood is a lot darker than the white. And it is something that you will just get better at through doing it and confidence. I remember when I started tattooing and I was scared of doing white, so I almost didn't tattoo it properly because I was worried that I was going to hurt someone. But they would definitely rather be hurt briefly than hurt over and over if you're having a nightmare with it. And if it's really that bad and you're really struggling to that degree, you can always stop and let it heal and just add it next time. There's nothing stopping you doing that. And I don't think you should be shy about doing that if you feel like you need to, because we are only human, and sometimes the skin is a nightmare, sometimes you have a nightmare. It just happens, and you can always have a second go. But you will find that it generally will bleed less as you get better at doing it. And it's just finding that place that works for you to do it. But again, I think if you're using quite a large mag for white, it's not the best idea. Again, the biggest that I'll go when I'm doing white is a 15, and they are 10 gauge as well, they're not 12, so they are still reasonably small for a 15. And I'm not going to put any white in those teeth at all because there isn't any on the reference and they look quite sunken. If you put a white highlight on them now, it kind of almost pulls them forwards, which they're not forwards in his face. So I'm going to just leave them. And they still have a tiny little bit of my client's skin showing through, which I would normally fully saturate everything, but I like how they look. So just because you have little rules and things that you do, you don't always have to stick to them if you feel like it's going to look good without doing something. I'm going to put a little tiny trim of white around this edge before we get to this pink background. So guys, that's the end of the tattoo, and we're going to move on to aftercare. Tattoo's finished, and I've just rubbed in some hustle butter into this, and I'm gonna just wrap this in cling film today and do it old school because my client's allergic to the glue on second skins. But ideally I would normally use a second skin, and I'd wrap that in that today to go home in, and I'd get them to change it in 24 hours and rewrap and keep that on for up to 4, maybe 5 days. By the time they take that second layer off, the tattoo's nearly fully healed. But we're going to wrap this in cling film now, and then I'm going to get my client to take this off when he's home and wash his tattoo clean, pat it dry. And basically I like people to keep their tattoos just clean and dry for the first 24 hours, especially when they're colour, because they can take quite a long time to just fully stop bleeding and weeping. Before you put any cream on, you want it to be dry because it's essentially, I think it's doubling up your moisture. So if it's already wet from you bleeding and you add cream, you don't need to make it any wetter. And then I say to apply that as and when you need it, but really just morning and evening is enough for most tattoos. And as thin as possible, and I'd recommend either hustle butter or Palmer's cocoa butter. And that's the aftercare, guys. And that's the tattoo done for the day. Thanks for watching me teach you how to do a horror portrait. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll get to you. And now I'm gonna go home and have a nap.